There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a room where a monstrous act is being prepared. It is not the absence of sound, but the suppression of it. It is the rustle of silk that sounds like a scream trapped in the throat, the clink of jewels that echoes like the closing of a cage door. In the autumn of 1396, in a lavishly appointed chamber in Paris, this silence was thick with the scent of lilies and statecraft. At its center stood a child, not yet 7 years old. Her name was Isabel of France, and she was being dressed for her wedding. The gown was a masterpiece of blue velvet, so heavily embroidered with golden fleurs-de-lis that the fabric could scarcely be seen. A fortune in pearls and sapphires was being woven into her hair, each gem a tiny, cold weight pressing down on her small skull. Her attendants moved with a reverent, almost fearful precision, their faces masks of practiced neutrality. They were arraying a sacrifice, not a bride. And as they worked, the little girl stood impossibly still, her eyes wide and dark, reflecting the glitter of the room, but betraying nothing of the maelstrom of confusion within. She was a princess, and she had been taught obedience above all else. But no lesson could truly prepare a child of 6 for this. To be handed over, a living treaty, to a man she had never met, a king from an enemy nation who was 5 times her age. This was not a marriage. It was a transaction of the highest and most brutal order, a human seal pressed onto a fragile truce. What does a child think in such a moment? Does she understand the words king, queen, England, peace? Or are they just sounds, as meaningless as the Latin of the Mass, a litany recited by grave-faced adults who have decided her fate in rooms she will never enter? The story of Isabel of France is one of the most haunting and tragic footnotes in the long, bloody history of the 100 Years' War. It is the story of what happens when the abstract necessities of diplomacy collide with the fragile reality of a single human life. It is a chronicle of a childhood stolen, of innocence bartered for political stability, and of the profound, lonely suffering of a girl who was crowned a queen before she had even learned to properly read. We are told this was a union for peace. But for the child at its heart, it was the beginning of a life lived in gilded captivity, a silent testament to the chilling calculus of power, where the happiness, the safety, and the very soul of a little girl were deemed a perfectly acceptable price to pay. To understand the tragedy of Isabel, one must first understand the madness from which she sprang. Her birthplace, the court of France in the late 14th century, was not a stable realm of chivalry and grandeur. It was a kingdom teetering on the edge of an abyss, held captive by the shattered mind of its own monarch. Isabel's father was King Charles VI, a man history would remember not for his victories or his wisdom, but as Charles the Mad. His reign had begun with promise, but in 1392, on a hot summer's day during a military campaign, something within him broke. In a sudden, violent delirium, he mistook his own knights for enemies and, screaming a betrayal, cut down 4 of them before being wrestled into submission. This was not a singular event. It was the onset of a recurring and terrifying psychosis that would plague him for the rest of his life. The attacks came without warning. Sometimes he would forget his own name, his own wife and children. He would run howling through the corridors of his palace, the Hotel St. Pol, for months on end. In one of his most disturbing delusions, he became convinced that he was made of glass and would refuse to let anyone touch him, fearing he might shatter into 1,000 pieces. He had special iron ribs sewn into his clothing to protect his fragile body. The Kingdom of France was thus ruled by a vacuum. When the king was lucid, he was a gentle, penitent man, horrified by his own actions. But when the madness descended, the state was rudderless, prey to the vicious ambitions of his powerful relatives, the Dukes of Burgundy and Orleans, who circled the throne like wolves, each eager to seize power for himself. Into this vortex of uncertainty and fear, Isabel was born in 1389. Her mother, Isabeau of Bavaria, was a figure of profound complexity and controversy. Married to Charles when she was young and vibrant, she was now the wife of a madman. Faced with a husband who often did not recognize her and a court rife with deadly political rivalries, Isabeau adapted. She became a formidable political operator in her own right, cultivating her own power base, managing the royal finances, and navigating the treacherous currents of the French court. She was accused by her enemies of extravagance, licentiousness, and a chilling neglect of her tormented husband. Whether these accusations were fair or simply misogynistic slander against a powerful woman is a matter of debate. What is certain is that Isabeau was a pragmatist. She saw her children, particularly her daughters, not merely with a mother's affection, but with a strategist's eye. They were assets, valuable pieces in the great game of European diplomacy. For a kingdom as vulnerable as France, a well-placed royal daughter could purchase something priceless: time, an alliance, peace. Isabel grew up in a world where the corridors echoed with her father's distant screams and her mother's hushed political conferences. It was a childhood steeped in a unique kind of dread, the juxtaposition of immense privilege and profound instability. She was a fille de France, a daughter of France, a title of immense prestige. But she was also the daughter of a broken man, a pawn in her mother's desperate efforts to keep the kingdom from disintegrating entirely. Across the Channel, England was wrestling with its own demons. Its king, Richard II, sat uneasily on his throne. He had come to power as a boy, and his reign had been scarred by the peasants' revolt and a constant, bitter struggle with a powerful and recalcitrant nobility, a group of magnates known as the Lords Appellant. Richard was a man of refined, even extravagant tastes. He patronized the arts, believed deeply in the divine majesty of kingship, and harbored an absolutist vision of monarchy that his powerful barons found both alien and threatening. By the 1390s, Richard was determined to crush his domestic enemies and end the ruinously expensive war with France that had drained the English treasury for generations. The war was the lifeblood of the old, martial aristocracy, the very men who opposed him. Peace, for Richard, was not just a diplomatic goal. It was a political weapon. A lasting truce with France would undercut his opponents, free up royal funds, and allow him to consolidate power in a way his predecessors never could. His first wife, the beloved Anne of Bohemia, had died in 1394, leaving him childless and consumed by a grief so profound he had the palace they shared torn down. Now, he needed a new wife, one who could seal his vision of peace. His gaze turned toward France. An alliance, cemented by marriage to a French princess, was the cornerstone of his grand strategy. It was a move calculated to enrage the war party in England and simultaneously bind France into a lasting accord. The negotiations began in earnest. The French, desperate for a respite from the English threat while they dealt with the king's madness, were receptive. The English, led by Richard's ambition, were eager. The result was the Truce of Lullingham, a pact intended to last for 28 years, an unprecedented span of peace in that era. And the linchpin of this entire agreement was to be the marriage of the 29-year-old King of England to Isabel, the 6-year-old daughter of the King of France. The proposal was, even by the standards of the day, shocking. Chroniclers like Jean Froissart noted the absurdity. When Richard's ambassadors first broached the subject, the French council was taken aback. The girl was a baby. She would not be able to fulfill the conjugal duties of a queen for a decade or more. How could such a union be considered a true marriage? But political necessity is a powerful solvent for moral objections. For France, it meant security. For Richard, it meant the triumph of his peace policy. The child's age was a secondary concern, an inconvenience to be managed. A massive dowry of 800,000 francs was agreed upon, a staggering sum that would help refill Richard's coffers. The deal was struck. In Paris, a proxy wedding was held. The Earl Marshal of England stood in for his king, a grown man making vows to a little girl who could barely comprehend the ceremony. She was now, in the eyes of the church and the state, the Queen of England. Her journey to her new life began shortly thereafter. A vast and magnificent procession escorted her from Paris to the coast. It was a public spectacle of reconciliation, a rolling pageant of peace. But for Isabel, it was a slow, inexorable journey away from everything she had ever known. At Calais, the last French outpost, she was to be formally handed over to the English. The meeting between the two kings was an elaborate piece of diplomatic theater, choreographed to the smallest detail. Tents of gold and silk were erected in the fields between the English and French territories. Charles VI, in a rare period of lucidity, was there to present his daughter. Richard II, resplendent in his royal finery, was there to receive her. The moment of the handover was the emotional and political climax of the entire endeavor. Isabel, dressed in the height of fashion, was led forward. Richard, a tall, handsome, and imposing figure, stepped forward to greet his child bride. An eyewitness account, preserved by a French chronicler, captures the surreal tenderness of the moment. Richard, seeing the little girl's apprehension, knelt before her. He spoke to her gently, reassuring her that he would be her friend and father, that she would be happy and honored in England as a great lady, as its queen. He picked her up in his arms and kissed her. To the assembled nobles, this was a masterful performance, a king showing his gentle and chivalrous nature. To Isabel, it must have been a whirlwind of awe and terror. The strange man with the kind voice who was now to be her husband, her lord, her entire world. The French escort wept openly as they bid her farewell. They were not just saying goodbye to a princess. They were watching a child being consigned to a foreign land, a beautiful, gilded offering left on the altar of a fragile peace. The great tent was struck, the armies withdrew, and Isabel of France crossed into English territory, leaving her childhood behind forever. Her arrival in England was met with all the pomp and ceremony befitting a new queen. She was officially married to Richard at Calais and then crowned at Westminster Abbey in a lavish ceremony in January 1397. Londoners thronged the streets to catch a glimpse of the little queen, as she was immediately nicknamed. She was a curiosity, a symbol of the controversial peace her husband had engineered. For Richard, her presence was a constant, public validation of his foreign policy. He established for her a magnificent household at Windsor Castle, complete with her own retinue of ladies-in-waiting, chamberlains, and servants. On the surface, she was treated with the utmost deference and honor. But a cage, no matter how gilded, remains a cage. Isabel was profoundly isolated. She was separated from her family, her home, her native language. The English court was a world of intricate etiquette and whispered intrigue, navigated by adults with complex ambitions and enmities. And she, a child of 7, was its nominal queen. Her primary companion and governess was the formidable Lady de Courcy, later replaced by the Duchess of Ireland. These women were tasked with her education and her acculturation, with transforming this little French princess into a proper English queen. Her days were structured and formal, filled with lessons in language, music, and courtly decorum. There was little room for the simple, spontaneous joys of childhood. The relationship that developed between Isabel and Richard is one of the strangest and most poignant aspects of her story. Richard, a man capable of both great charm and chilling ruthlessness, treated his child wife with a surprising and consistent tenderness. He seemed to recognize the inherent absurdity and cruelty of her position. He never attempted to consummate the marriage. She was a queen in title only. He visited her often at Windsor, bringing her gifts, talking with her, and taking a genuine interest in her well-being. The chronicler Froissart, who visited the English court during this time, observed their interactions firsthand. He wrote that the king was delighted by her, for she was learning to speak English well and was possessed of a natural poise and dignity far beyond her years. Richard seemed to find in her a kind of innocent, uncomplicated affection that was absent from the rest of his treacherous court. He treated her less like a wife and more like a cherished daughter or a precious ward. He would sit with her for hours, holding her hand, and seemed to find solace in her company. For Isabel, this powerful, often intimidating man was the sole anchor in her alien world. He was the source of all her honor and security. She, in turn, developed a deep and unwavering devotion to him, the kind of fierce loyalty a child might feel for a protective father figure. This bond, however gentle, could not mask the fundamental truth. She was his political property. Her value was tied entirely to his reign and the French alliance. Her happiness was incidental. Her strategic importance was paramount. While Isabel was learning English and playing with her ladies-in-waiting at Windsor, the kingdom around her was curdling. The peace with France was deeply unpopular. Many of England's great lords viewed it as a national humiliation, a betrayal of the glorious victories of Edward III and the Black Prince. They saw Richard's French queen not as a symbol of peace, but as a symbol of his weakness and his preference for decadent, foreign ways over the martial traditions of England. Richard, for his part, felt emboldened by the truce. No longer needing to fund a war, he set about consolidating his power with a terrifying single-mindedness. In 1397, he struck against his old enemies, the Lords Appellant. He had the Duke of Gloucester, his own uncle, arrested and secretly murdered. The Earl of Arundel was executed, and the Earl of Warwick was exiled. He purged Parliament, packing it with his supporters, and declared that the laws of the kingdom resided in his own breast. Richard was transforming himself from a medieval king into an absolute monarch, and his rule became a tyranny. The court, once a place of chivalric display, was now thick with fear and suspicion. A network of spies reported any hint of dissent. Arbitrary arrests and confiscations became commonplace. Isabel, insulated within her royal household, was likely shielded from the worst of this, but she could not have been entirely ignorant of the tension that crackled in the air. The man who was so gentle and fatherly to her was becoming a figure of terror to his own subjects. Her very presence, the small French girl at the heart of the court, was a constant reminder of the policies that had enabled this descent into autocracy. She was an innocent bystander in a political storm of her husband's making, a storm that was about to break with catastrophic force. The fatal miscalculation came in 1399. Richard's most powerful remaining rival was his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Hereford, son of the enormously wealthy and influential John of Gaunt. After a dispute with another noble, Richard had exiled Bolingbroke for 10 years. A short time later, John of Gaunt died. In an act of fatal arrogance and greed, Richard seized the vast Lancastrian estates that were Bolingbroke's rightful inheritance. This was a step too far. It was a direct assault on the principle of property and inheritance that underpinned the entire aristocratic order. If the king could disinherit the Duke of Lancaster, no nobleman's land was safe. Having alienated his nobility and secured his inheritance, Richard then made another fateful decision. He departed for a military campaign in Ireland to quell a rebellion. It was the opportunity his enemies had been waiting for. With the king and his army overseas, England was left vulnerable, governed by the aging and ineffectual Duke of York. Henry Bolingbroke saw his chance. Breaking his exile, he landed at Ravenspur in Yorkshire, claiming initially that he had returned only to reclaim his stolen inheritance. But this was a fiction. Disaffected nobles, tired of Richard's tyranny, flocked to his banner. What began as a personal quest for justice rapidly transformed into a full-blown rebellion. Henry Bolingbroke marched south, his army swelling with every passing day. The kingdom was rising against its king. For 10-year-old Isabel, the world turned upside down with bewildering speed. As Bolingbroke's forces advanced, the Duke of York, her nominal protector, panicked. He moved the young queen and her household from the comfortable familiarity of Windsor to the more fortified Wallingford Castle. This was not a move for her comfort, but for her security as a high-value asset. She was now, unequivocally, a prisoner. News from the outside world was sparse and heavily controlled. Her familiar routines were shattered. Her French attendants, her last link to her homeland, whispered fearfully amongst themselves. Isabel, who had been taught to see her entire purpose through the lens of her husband's power, must have been consumed with a terrifying confusion. Where was the king? When was he coming back? The men who had bowed to her yesterday now looked at her with a mixture of pity and calculation. She was no longer just the Queen of England. She was Richard's queen, and Richard's cause was collapsing. The Duke of York, seeing the hopelessness of the situation, soon defected and joined Bolingbroke. Isabel was now in the hands of her husband's greatest enemy. She was moved again, this time to Leeds Castle, kept under closer guard. Her gilded cage had become a stark and frightening prison. Richard returned from Ireland to find his kingdom lost. His support had evaporated. His army deserted him. He was cornered, betrayed, and forced to surrender to Bolingbroke at Flint Castle in Wales. The meeting between the two cousins was heavy with portent. Richard, the divine king, was now captive. Henry, the usurper, was the master of England. Richard was brought to London as a prisoner and publicly humiliated, forced to ride through the same streets that had once cheered him, now facing a jeering, hostile crowd. He was imprisoned in the Tower of London, where he was compelled to sign a deed of abdication. A parliament, packed with Bolingbroke supporters, formally deposed him, citing a long list of grievances that painted him as a tyrant unfit to rule. On September 30th, 1399, Henry Bolingbroke was proclaimed King Henry IV. The reign of Richard II was over. The peace with France was shattered, and Isabel, at just 10 years of age, was a widow in all but name, the queen of a king who was no longer a king, stranded in a hostile country that had overthrown her husband and protector. Her entire reason for being in England had been erased in a matter of weeks. The symbol of peace had become a relic of a deposed regime, a deeply inconvenient and politically explosive problem for the new king. For the new monarch, Henry IV, the existence of Isabel was a delicate and dangerous issue. She was the daughter of the King of France, a living link to the old regime, and a symbol of the peace treaty he had no intention of honoring. Furthermore, she was Richard's anointed queen, and her presence was a reminder that Richard, though deposed, was still alive, a potential rallying point for any future rebellion. Henry's first move was to try and absorb her into his own dynasty. He proposed a marriage between Isabel and his own son and heir, the young Prince Henry of Monmouth, the future hero of Agincourt. From a political standpoint, it was a logical move. It would preserve the French connection, neutralize Isabel as a threat, and lend a veneer of continuity to his new, usurped dynasty. He sent emissaries to Isabel, who was then being held at Sonning, a manor near Reading, to present the proposal. What happened next was extraordinary. This 10-year-old girl, who had lost everything, her crown, her husband, her security, and was effectively a prisoner, demonstrated a will of iron. She utterly refused. Weeping with grief and outrage, she declared her unshakable loyalty to her husband, King Richard. She told Henry's men that as long as Richard was alive, she would consider herself his wife and would never consent to marry another. It was an act of astonishing defiance from a child in a powerless position. It was a testament to the deep bond she had formed with Richard and a refusal to be a pawn in the new king's game. Her grief was not just for her lost status. It was a genuine, personal mourning for the man who had shown her kindness. Henry IV, frustrated by her obstinacy, was forced to change his approach. Isabel's life descended into a state of limbo. She was a queen with no kingdom, a wife with an imprisoned husband. Henry IV tightened the conditions of her captivity. He dismissed her loyal French household, including her governess, Lady de Courcy, and replaced them with English attendants loyal to him. This was a calculated act of cruelty, designed to isolate her further and break her spirit. She was now surrounded entirely by strangers, the servants of the man who had overthrown her lord. She was moved from one royal residence to another, first Sonning, then Havering at Bower, always under guard, her communications with the outside world severed. In France, news of Richard's deposition and Isabel's effective imprisonment was met with fury. Her father, Charles VI, though often lost in his madness, was lucid enough at times to understand the insult. The French court demanded her immediate and safe return, along with the full repayment of her enormous dowry. Henry IV, however, had no intention of cooperating so easily. Isabel was his most valuable bargaining chip. He stalled, prevaricated, and made counterdemands. For nearly 2 years, the diplomatic wrangling continued, while Isabel remained a lonely captive in England. Then, in February of 1400, the final blow fell. A rebellion in favor of the deposed king, known as the Epiphany Rising, was brutally crushed by Henry IV. The plot, led by some of Richard's loyal supporters, aimed to assassinate Henry and restore Richard to the throne. Though it failed, it made one thing terrifyingly clear to the new king. As long as Richard of Bordeaux lived, the throne would never be secure. Shortly after the rebellion was put down, the official announcement was made. Richard II was dead. He had died in his prison cell at Pontefract Castle, a grim fortress in Yorkshire. The official cause of death, circulated by Henry's government, was self-starvation. The story went that Richard, upon hearing of the failure of the rising, had fallen into a deep despair and refused all food and drink. This narrative was convenient, absolving Henry of any direct responsibility. But few believed it. The timing was too perfect, the cause of death too politically useful. The overwhelming suspicion, both then and now, is that Richard was murdered on Henry's orders, likely starved to death deliberately by his jailers. His body was brought to London and put on public display in St. Paul's Cathedral, but only his face was shown to quell rumors he was still alive while hiding the likely signs of forced starvation on his body. For Isabel, the news was the confirmation of her deepest fears. The man she had revered, her husband and protector, was gone forever, dead in a dark northern prison. At the age of 11, she was officially a widow. Her world, already shrunk to the size of a single guarded manor house, now collapsed into a point of pure, inconsolable grief. With Richard dead, Isabel's value as a potential bride for the Prince of Wales diminished, while the French demands for her return intensified. Keeping her in England was now more of a liability than an asset for Henry IV. After prolonged and acrimonious negotiations, he finally relented. He agreed to send her home, but in a final act of political spite and financial opportunism, he refused to repay the vast majority of her dowry, claiming it was forfeit or had been spent on her upkeep. In the summer of 1401, after nearly 5 years in England, Isabel began her journey home. It was a somber and melancholy procession, a stark contrast to the magnificent pageant that had brought her to England. She traveled to Dover, where she embarked for Calais, the same port where she had been handed over to Richard with such ceremony. She was now returning not as a triumphant queen, but as a teenage widow, a failed political alliance personified. She had left France a child of 6, a symbol of hope and peace. She returned a girl of 12, her life already defined by deposition, captivity, and death. The English had taken her innocence, her crown, and her dowry, and were now sending back the empty vessel. Isabel's return to France was not a return to a safe and stable haven. The French court was more fractured than ever. Her father's madness was a constant, looming presence. Her mother, Queen Isabeau, and her uncle, Louis, Duke of Orleans, were locked in a venomous power struggle with the fearsome John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. Isabel, with her status as the Dowager Queen of England, was once again a valuable piece on the chessboard of dynastic politics. Her experiences in England had forged her. She was no longer a naive child. She had witnessed the brutal realities of power, betrayal, and loss. Accounts from this period describe her as preternaturally mature, possessing a quiet dignity and a profound sadness. She carried the weight of her past with a grace that impressed all who met her. But her future was not her own to decide. Her mother and Uncle soon arranged another marriage for her. In 1406, at the age of 17, she was married to her cousin, Charles, the young Duke of Orleans. He was a handsome, cultured, and sensitive young man, already gaining a reputation as one of the finest poets of his generation. He was 12 years old, making him far closer to her in age than Richard had been. For the first time in her life, Isabel was in a relationship that held the promise of genuine companionship and affection. The marriage to Charles of Orleans appears to have been a period of brief, sunlit happiness in Isabel's otherwise shadowed life. The couple shared a love of literature, music, and the refined arts. They were well matched in temperament and intelligence. Living away from the immediate chaos of the royal court, they seem to have found a measure of personal peace and contentment together. For 3 years, Isabel experienced a life that approximated normalcy. She was a wife, a duchess, and, for a short while, she was allowed to be a young woman, not just a political symbol. She became pregnant in 1409, and the future seemed to hold the possibility of the domestic stability she had never known. But the shadow of the ongoing conflict between France and England was long, and it would soon fall over her once more. The fragile truce she had once embodied was a distant memory. The tensions that would eventually erupt into the next, even more devastating phase of the Hundred Years' War were building inexorably. Her newfound happiness was to be tragically and brutally short-lived. The final act of Isabel's tragic story was not played out in a grand political theater, but in the quiet, desperate intimacy of a birthing chamber. In September 1409, at the Château de Blois, Isabel gave birth to a daughter, whom they named Joan. The delivery was difficult, and Isabel, her constitution likely weakened by the accumulated stress and trauma of her young life, never recovered. She contracted puerperal fever, a common and often fatal infection following childbirth in the pre-modern era. For days she lingered, her strength failing. Charles, her young husband, was distraught, remaining by her side. But there was nothing the royal physicians could do. On September 13th, 1409, Isabel of France, Dowager Queen of England and Duchess of Orleans, died. She was not yet 20 years old. Her life, which had begun with such immense political weight placed upon her tiny shoulders, ended in a quiet, private tragedy. Her death was a footnote in the grand chronicles of the time, eclipsed by the larger political dramas unfolding across Europe. But her young husband was devastated. Charles of Orleans would go on to have his own life defined by tragedy. 6 years later, he would be captured at the Battle of Agincourt and would spend the next 25 years as a prisoner in England, writing the melancholy poetry for which he is famous. He would never forget his first wife. The legacy of Isabel is a quiet but profound one. It is a story that forces us to look beyond the sweeping narratives of battles and treaties and to confront the human cost of dynastic ambition. Was Richard II's kindness to her genuine affection a flicker of humanity in a ruthless political operator? Or was it merely the careful tending of a valuable asset, the polishing of a precious jewel he intended to use? Was Henry IV's treatment of her a calculated act of cruelty, or the unavoidable pragmatism of a usurper trying to secure his throne? These questions linger, shrouded in the ambiguity of centuries. But the answers are, in a sense, irrelevant to the central truth of her existence. Whatever the motivations of the men who controlled her life, the result for Isabel was the same: a childhood sacrificed, a life circumscribed by the needs of others. Her story serves as a stark and uncomfortable reminder that the great tapestries of history are woven with individual threads of human suffering. The official portraits and laudatory chronicles present an image of queens and princesses as serene figures of power and grace. But behind the velvet and jewels was often a reality of profound powerlessness, loneliness, and fear. Isabel was a queen who never held power, a wife who was twice a political pawn, and a woman whose brief moments of happiness were snatched away by the relentless tides of war and politics. We are left, in the end, with the image with which we began: a 6-year-old girl standing in a cold Parisian room, being weighed down by a wedding gown so heavy she could barely stand. Her entire life was an echo of that moment, a constant bearing of burdens that were not her own, a life lived in service to a peace that never lasted and a crown that was ultimately a curse. She was the peace offering, the child hostage, the little queen. Her brief, tragic journey through the courts of France and England is more than just a historical curiosity. It is a cautionary tale, a testament to the brutal reality that lurks behind the glittering facade of power. It exposes the fiction that the lives of the great are somehow removed from the fundamental pains of the human condition. In the story of Isabel of France, we see not a distant historical figure, but the ghost of a child who was asked to pay the price for the ambitions of kings and who paid it in full.